Philosophy never arises from or through science. Philosophy can never belong to the same order as the sciences. It belongs to a higher order, and not just logically, as it were, or in a table of a system of sciences. Philosophy stands in a completely different domain and rank of spiritual Dasein. Only poetry is of the same order as philosophical thinking, although thinking and poetry are not identical. Talking about nothing remains forever an abomination and an absurdity for science. But aside from the philosopher, the poet can also talk about nothing, and not because the procedure of poetry, in opinion of everyday understanding, is less rigorous, but because, in a comparison to all mere science, an essential superiority of the spirit holds sway in poetry. Only genuine and great poetry is meant. Because of this superiority, the poet always speaks as if beings were expressed and addressed for the first time. That is very interesting that he's saying poetry and philosophy are kind of buddies. Because many poets have to sit and really think about what they want to write, what they want to express, and to be concise, yet explicit and very clear with the words they use. So too do a lot of philosophers, because they really, when they make arguments, they have to really make every word count. So I'll grant him that. But aside from the philosopher, the poet can also talk about nothing, and not because the procedure of poetry is the opinion of everyday understanding. So that's it. We're gonna go over that. That's good. Because of this superiority, the poet always speaks as if beings were expressed and addressed for the first time. I repeated that because a bad poet would definitely sound like you've heard that before. A good poet, I believe, is identified by the uniqueness and originality of their works that make you think in all new ways and open different pathways in your mind. In the poetry of the poet and in the thinking of the thinker, there is always so much world space to spare that each and everything, a tree, a mountain, a horse, the call of a bird, completely loses its monotony and familiarity. True talk of nothing always remains unfamiliar. It does not allow itself to be made common. It dissolves, to be sure. If one places it in the cheap acid of a merely logical cleverness, this is why we cannot begin to speak about nothing immediately, as we can in describing a picture, for example. But the possibility of such speech about nothing can be indicated. Consider a passage from one of the latest works of the poet Knut Hamsun. The Road Leads On, 1934, translation, page 464. The work belongs together with The Wayfarer in August. The Road Leads On depicts the last years and the end of this man, August, who embodies the uprooted, universal know-how of today's humanity, but in the form of a Dasein that cannot lose its ties to unfamiliar, because in its despairing powerlessness it remains genuine and superior. In this last days, this August is alone in the high mountains, the poet says. He sits here between his ears and hears true emptiness, quite amusing, a fancy. On the ocean, earlier, August often went to sea. Something stirred at least, and there was a sound, something audible, a water chorus. Here nothing meets nothing, and is not there. There is not even a hole. One can only shake one's head in resignation. So, there it is, after all, something peculiar about nothing. Something peculiar about nothing. There's a play in Shakespeare called Much Ado About Nothing. Ah, interesting. Maybe that's a crossover, a hint at Shakespeare. Thus, we want to take up our interrogative sentence again and question through it, and see whether this, instead of nothing, simply represents a turn of phrase that says nothing and is arbitrarily appended, or whether even in the preliminary expression of the question it has an essential sense. To this end, let us stick at first to the abbreviated, apparently simpler and supposedly more rigorous question: why are there beings at all? If we ask in this way, we start out from the beings they are. They are given to us, they are in front of us, and can thus be found before us at any time, and are also known to us within certain domains. Now, the beings given to us in this way are immediately interrogated as their ground. The questioning advances directly towards a ground. Such a method just broadens and enlarges, as it were, a procedure that is practiced every day. Somewhere in the vineyard, for example, an infestation turns up, something indisputably present at hand. One asks, where did this come from, and where is its ground? Similarly, as a whole, beings are presented at hand. One asks, where and what is the ground? This kind of questioning is represented in the simple formula, why are there beings? Where and what is their ground? Tactically, one is asking for another, higher being. But here the question does not pertain at all to beings as a whole and as such. But if we ask the question in the form of our initial interrogative sentence, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Then the addition prevents us in questioning, from beginning directly with beings as unquestionably given, and having hardly begun, already moving on to the ground we are seeking, which is also in being. Instead, these beings are held out in a questioning manner into the possibility of not being. In this way, the why gains a completely different power and urgency of questioning. Why are beings torn from the possibility of not being? Why do they not fall back into the constantly with no further ado? Beings are no longer what just happens to be present at hand. They begin to waver, regardless of whether we know beings with all certainty, regardless of whether we grasp them in their full scope or not. From now on, beings as such waver insofar as we put them into question. The oscillation of this wavering reaches out into the most extreme and sharpest counter-possibility of beings, into not being and nothing. This search for the why now transforms itself accordingly. It does not just try to provide a present-at-hand ground for explaining what is present at hand. Instead, we are now searching for a ground that is supposed to grow the dominance of beings as an overcoming of nothing. We are now searching for a ground that is supposed to ground the dominance of beings as an overcoming of nothing. So beings, basically, we should, if I get this right, we need to try to overcome nothing. The form of turning into nothing. That we have to be dominant in our lives, have a strong will. The ground in question is now questioned as the ground of the decision for beings over against nothing, more precisely as the ground for the wavering of the beings that sustain us and unbind us, half in being, half in not in being, which is also why we cannot wholly belong to anything, not even to ourselves. Yet Dasein is in each case mine. So Dasein is more a part of us than even ourselves. That's an interesting thing to say. The qualification in each case, mine, signifies Dasein is thrown to me so that myself may be Dasein. But Dasein means care of the being of beings as such that it is exactly disclosed in care, not only of human being. Dasein is in each case mine. This means neither that it is posited by me, nor that it is confined to isolated ego. Dasein is itself by virtue of its essential connection to being as such. This is what the oft-repeated sentence in being and time means. The understanding of being belongs to Dasein. Interesting. The understanding of being belongs to the Dasein. You'll become Dasein then once you understand being. And that Dasein is essential to us understanding virtue and ourselves. Very interesting.